everyone. My name is Sofia Gomez. I'm a senior here at Meredith College, and this is my senior thesis, Political Violence in Venezuela. Does oil policy fuel the fire? And before we begin, I would like to give a special thanks to Dr. Martinson, who was my faculty advisor during this process. So diving into my research question and my need for research, I wanted to find out, does oil policy affect the incident of political violence in Venezuela? I felt that this was an important study because Venezuela has the largest global oil reserves in the world with over 17% of the global shares, and they're also one of the largest oil suppliers to the United States. So to see the rise of violence since the early 2000s and still happening, I was just curious to see if privatization, market-driven oil policies could relate to an increase of political violence. I was also interested and I wanted to know whether lower oil revenues will relate to increased political violence. So diving into my literature review, I wanted to find out more about the resource curse. Stanford political scientist Terry Carl argued that countries who fall into this category of extraordinary singular resource wealth would also create extraordinary corruption, less diversification on the economy, and less investments with a decline of growth. And it would even possibly lead to less accountability and democracy. This would lead into my second part of my literature, which was privatization and versus socialization. I had used McGowan's Privatize This, Assessing the Opportunities and the Cost of Privatization. This is where they speak on the pros and cons of privatizing an industry. However, my main goal with this was helping me define what privatization was going to be, and it was when a business is market-based driven. Following this, I had used Gallego's definition for socialization, which was the collective ownership, which focuses on the Commonwealth decisions. For my methods section, I had decided to analyze oil policy, revenue, and political violence within the three time periods that held significance. We started off with the year of 1974 and 1989 to present the first period, and the main events were the formation of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, also known as OPEC, along with the Petroleros de Venezuela Sociedad Anónimas, also known as PDVSA. OPEC's main purpose was to regulate oil prices around the world, either by reducing or increasing supply availability, while PDVSA had begun as a nationalized oil industry. Moving on to period 2, we see the beginning transitions of privatization in Venezuela, which led to the infamous El Caracazo and the pre-Chavez era. Into time period 3, it was more focused on the 2000 to 2016, and this highlighted Chavez's election, the process of complete socialization, and Maduro's election. As for my methods, for my primary sources, I had focused on text of laws and published interviews from previous government ministries and oil executives. Luis Guesti and Romulo Betancourt were just two examples. Luis Guesti was one of the shell operators in Venezuela with PDVSA when it first opened in 1976, and he was there up until 1999. So he was there for a lot of the transitions that we're going to see in the next few slides. And he is also known today for consistently speaking and writing about the changes and the consolidations that were occurring. As for Romulo Betancourt, he is considered to be the founding father of democracy in Venezuela, and Betancourt established a new constitution and inaugurated a program of moderate social reform, and he was also able to exercise greater control over the petroleum industry, which was something that was not seen prior. As for my secondary sources, I had used many newspaper articles, such as those from El Nacional and other documents to record on major events, such as El Caracazo. I had also used government agencies, such as the Environmental Investigation Agency, which helped with identifying revenue profits of this time period, and the VDEM database from the University of Gothenburg, which helped me identify the political violence rates with these various time periods. So as for my findings, I had to define political violence. And the way that I had defined political violence was the use of physical force to achieve political objectives by non-state actors. The restrictions to political objectives excluded profit-driven crime violence. And what I mean by non-state, I was referring to individuals or entities that are not formally part of the state. Thus, politically oriented militias and youth group would be considered a non-state actor. After that, after I made my definition, I had decided to make a scale from 0 to 4, 0 being not often, like violence was not occurring as often, 1 being rare, non-state actors rarely use political violence, 2 being occasionally, non-state actors occasionally use political violence, and 3, frequently, non-state actors frequently use violence, and 4 being often, non-state actors often use political violence. Moving forward with the graph, in the first period, we see that the trends are stable and are still within the normal deviations of being considered as a rare occurrence. As we move to period 2, we see the beginning of volatility in which the violence moved from the scale of 1 to 2 and back to 1 again. And for period 3, we see a continuous increase of violence jumping from level 1 to reaching to level 4, which indicated violence was occurring often. In regards to the oil policy, in period 1, which is near the bottom, we see that the policy are transitioning from nationalization to privatization. And going to period 2, it is stable, being in the middle of the nationalization and the privatization. And moving on to level 3, period 3, we see that everything has slowly gravitated or fully gravitated towards the socialization side. As for the oil revenues, in period 1, we see that oil revenues were not consistent, and we noticed that there was a slight downward trend. For period 2, we see that there is a consistent trend with revenues with a slight incline nearing the end. And for period 3, there were various high highs and various low lows, which also helped to explain the volatility of the industry of the time. Going on to my conclusion, oil policy does seem to correlate to increased rates of political violence in Venezuela. For period 1, the oil policy, we see that there is an emerging transition from privatization to nationalization, and the violence is stable, signifying that it was not consistent. And going into period 2, we see that the policy was consistent and the violence had begun to become more unstable. And finally, for period 3, we see that there was an immediate shift from privatization to socialization, thus moving into the next graph when during the same period there was political violence that had increased exponentially. As for the oil revenues do not appear to correlate to increased rates of political violence in Venezuela. In period 1, we see that the oil revenue was not consistent and we notice a slight downward trend. This could be considered to the oil boom of the 1970s and then dropping during the 1980s energy crisis. And in relation to the violence, as mentioned prior, violence in this time period was considered rare. For period 2, we see that there is a consistent trend in the revenue with a slight incline nearing the end. This possibly could be indicating the rise of Chavez's election process of 1999, and the violence of this time was volatile. And lastly, for the third period, this was the only time where there could have been a correlation between violence and revenue. As we see in both charts, there is both a sharp incline. As for limitation, directions, and future research, some of the limitations I had was that there was a lack of overall data from the first time period. This could be due because there's a lot of coups occurring and a lot of political instability in the government. And also with that instability, it was very difficult to find revenue of this time because there was just a lot of instability not only happening there in Venezuela, but also around the world to keep track of. Yeah, and thank you everyone. I hope you enjoyed my presentation and cannot wait to hear your questions.